You know the rules. So we have this session. It's a great pleasure to be here among some good friends, colleagues. We have 90 minutes for this session, 4 papers. So we'll be assigning 20 minutes per paper and the remaining time, so 2.5 minutes, just in case there are some questions for the author. Ariel, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, and thank you all. Thank you, Christian, and thank you for everybody for joining. This paper is co-authored with Luca, and he's at Aarhus University. It's on quality, misallocation, trade, and regulations. Okay, so let me quickly get to the introduction. I think we're all pretty familiar with the literature on trade policy cooperation, which the way we have learned it treats negotiation over tariffs as a way of eliminating negative externalities that might exist. For example, there's beggar thy neighbor type of events where essentially countries can take advantage of positive terms of trade externalities or delocation effect to raise their tariffs and raise their own welfare in essentially as a way of taking away welfare from other countries. However, in modern trade agreements, tariffs are already quite low, and there's been a push towards dealing with regulations, product standards, and other types of these regulations, which tend to be seen as non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, there's legitimate reasons why these are imposed. Usually these are imposed on the domestic economy for reasons that have to do with more domestic preferences and trying to eliminate some sort of externalities such as health, safety, these types of things. So a good example is, for example, the regulations on the amount of residue that pesticides can, amount of residue that you can have when you use pesticides in the country. Okay, now, one thing that we want to highlight from these regulations and standards is if you're thinking about them in terms of international trade, they are non-discriminatory as long as they fit within the WTO regulations. However, they are discriminatory in a way across firms, right? Because the way that they work is they try to essentially eliminate certain low quality firms, right? If you think about low quality firms as those firms that are using the worst type of pesticide, right? Or the ones that tend to have worse health outcomes, right? In that type of sense, what you're trying to do is getting rid of low quality firms, which tend to also be the smallest firms, and also the firms that probably won't be able to afford to pay out to pay through some sort of fixed cost that's necessary to adhere to a regulation. The literature in trade has kind of looked at these as a way of backwards protectionism in a way, okay? And so there are ways in which you can see how these regulations, although they're non-discriminatory, they can be used in a way that's kind of a murky protectionism, or even as a way of relocating firms to the home country. And this is something that Grossman, a recent econometric paper, Grossman et al. Looked at. Okay, so there's still ways in which these can reduce competition. However, one thing that the literature really hasn't looked at in terms of the competitive consequences is that they're also reallocating production away from these low quality firms that find it most difficult to adhere to the regulations to high quality firms. And actually you'll see that they might even encourage entry of bigger, higher quality firm as these low quality firms are eliminated. Okay, so it's the second type of effect that we're going to be really looking at in this paper. And there's 2 research questions that come out of it. So first of all, what is the welfare consequence of this type of reallocation on the imposing country? So let's say Chile wants to impose these types of regulations. What's going to be the welfare effect within Chile? Like, why would they want to impose this type of regulation strictly for these type of consequences? And then also, what is the corresponding incentive for cooperation, given essentially what effect these have on other countries? Okay, so I'll get to these 2 questions in a second. Let me just start with some motivational evidence about the effect of these regulations on trade. And this really relates to other kind of a small literature, but there is a small literature that we're going to essentially confirm in our paper and then extend to some degree. But I'm not gonna have time to really cover this literature or cover what we do in the paper. So let me just say that essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna show the way that these regulations really act on the extensive margin of trade. Again, this goes with this paper by Fernandez et al. From the World Bank, and then also Fontanier and co-authors have done a paper in the GIE. Both of these papers show, and then what we're confirming in this paper is that when you impose these types of regulations, because they act mostly on these small, low-quality firms, they're going to really affect the extensive margin. So they're going to reduce the number of exporters that are selling to the destinations that have the most regulations, but they don't have a large effect on the intensive margin. So once an exporter has decided to sell somewhere with a lot of regulations, it's not necessarily going to reduce the value of the exports that they sell. Okay, so that we're able to confirm here. We have an empirical exercise. We also show these other results that are not in the literature, but I'm really not going to have time to really talk about the implications in this talk. Right, but there is a way in which, if say Chile imposes a regulation, it's going to have a differential effect on Chilean firms and Mexican firms and Ecuadorian firms or say European firms, depending on essentially how many high quality firms exist in each one of the origin countries. Okay, so what I'm going to really talk about today is going through this model and then the implications for welfare. So the model is, you'll see, in a way, kind of takes some basic elements where you have firm heterogeneity, but the heterogeneity is in quality. You have variable markups, and these variable markups imply that there's going to be a misallocation of production, right? So there's going to be essentially an average quality that is too low because you have these high quality firms that have too much market power and low quality firms that have too little market power. And so this misallocation exists. The regulation imposes a fixed cost. And so what we show is that this regulation, if it's put in as a fixed cost, can actually improve welfare unilaterally, okay? Taking into account the fact that it's going to reduce competition in some ways. By reducing the number of excessive low quality firms, it's going to increase, it's going to have a way of increasing welfare through the increased entry of high quality firms and increasing the average quality produced, right? And of course, this is going to have a trade-off, and the optimal amount of standards are going to be above kind of laissez-faire, but not necessarily that high. Okay, so this, I think, so this is really one part of the first finding. The second finding is that actually these domestic regulations actually have a positive effect as well in foreign countries. So whereas you might expect some bigger than neighbor policies in the same, or bigger than neighbor rationales in the same way you found in the with tariffs, that's actually not the case with these regulations, because they have this positive effect on the other country, because they, again, what they're doing is they're encouraging entry of high quality firms in the foreign countries, even though they're also reducing kind of the number of low quality firms that can enter from a foreign country. And we have also this comparison with tariffs, and you'll see the kind of, they work in a different way than tariffs work, because tariffs have this negative externality, whereas these regulations actually impose a positive externality. And then I won't have much time to talk about an estimation, but we take this model then to kind of this quantitative exercise where we ask a couple of questions. So what are the welfare effects of raising standards? And we could do that by essentially just looking at kind of the standard the hat algebra, where you just raise standards and you see what is the change in welfare. And then we can actually see some of the externalities in this estimation. We'll see if I have time to show that. Okay, so quickly getting into the model. As I said, the ingredients themselves, I think probably you've seen before. You have a type of consumer preferences that are non-homothetic, so it's going to allow for this this way in which firms face changes, or firms face heterogeneous demand elasticities, and there's going to be essentially firm heterogeneity, so there's going to be variable market power, and this is what generates inefficiency. This is what the consumer preferences look like. It's essentially, here I'm showing you the indirect demand curve. You can see how it's non-homothetic because it depends on income, Y. And then what we're doing here is we're changing this to, instead of being heterogeneity in productivity, it's heterogeneity in quality. So each firm has a demand shifter Z, that's the quality of the firm. So firms will actually be, firms will be homogeneous in costs, so they'll have the same productivity, but because they have heterogeneity in the quality draw, that's where the heterogeneity is going to come from. Okay, so firms choose quality from Pareto distribution. This gives essentially a way in which the draw of the quality then is going to map onto size heterogeneity, and there's going to be this way in which I think what we've seen in the previous literature, that as firms get bigger, right, so higher quality firms, as they get bigger, they face smaller demand elasticity, and so they're able to get more market power. And so the higher quality firms are going to underproduce as they have a lot of market power. The low quality firms will overproduce, and you get this equilibrium where in the market allocation, there's this misallocation that exists. Okay, now the government is going to have two types of policies. They're going to be able to choose tariffs, and they're going to be able to choose the regulatory costs. Of course, the point of this paper is really to look at the regulatory costs. Yes, that's going to be the main thing that I want to show you. So the regulations come in as a fixed cost. It's a compliance cost that all firms have to pay. So it's the same F that every firm has to pay in order to sell in country J. Intuitively speaking, really what's happening is that the cutoff is going to change with this regulation. So in the market allocation, there's a Z-star cutoff, which is like the minimum quality that you need in order to enter a market, right? Similar to the Mallett's productivity threshold. When you introduce a fixed cost of compliance, it's going to raise that threshold to Z bar. Now, the nice thing about this, so I mean, there's kind of a lot of algebra here, but basically what happens is that the governments are essentially imposing a fixed cost, but by imposing that fixed cost, they are just making it tougher to enter by some amount. So you can map to any fixed cost a Z bar, which is the new threshold necessary to enter a market. Okay. And so really what we're going to do is to say the government, what they're doing is they're choosing the Z bar, which is to essentially reduce the number of firms that can survive. And the way that we're going to actually estimate this is by thinking about a restrictiveness measure that's the Z bar, the new Z bar, relative to the market allocation would give. Okay, and that's what G is. So if G is equal to 1, there's no fixed cost, there's no regulation, because the Z bar and Z star are the same. However, if you see that essentially the distribution of firms is different than what you would get under the market allocation, right? Given the parameters that you have that you can generate that, then G is greater than 1, and essentially you can estimate what is the amount of restrictiveness that we see in an economy. Okay, you can also see that this G, although the country also only sets GJJ essentially to itself, it's going to affect different countries differentially for the reasons that I talked about. And you can kind of see that from this equation here. That, of course, it's kind of hard to follow, but what's going to happen is that depending on the characteristics of the other country, essentially how many high quality firms they have, the restrictiveness is going to change. So Chile imposes a regulation. The way that's perceived by Europe and the way that's perceived by Ecuador is going to be different depending on the number of high quality firms in the origin country. Okay, so the first result I can give you is actually that there's going to be this way in which welfare can increase in Chile when they impose this regulation. You can see that there's this hump-shaped relationship between the regulation and welfare. Okay, so let me just go through the intuition of why this happens. It's going to come through this trade-off between allocative efficiency and a waste of compliance costs. Okay, there's this exit of low-quality firms. The market was misallocated to begin with, right? That's a key thing. So if you're assuming that the market is efficient, because if you have something like CES preferences, you'll never get this rationale for imposing regulations other than the health externalities and other types of externalities you might be looking at, right? So because the market is misallocated, this exit of low quality firms is going to raise welfare, while at the same time trading off the loss of variety and the loss of competition. Okay, but we essentially what we've shown in a separate paper is that this allocated efficiency gain is always going to be is usually going to be present on the most parameterizations. At the same time, there is going to be this terms of trade effect, right? So as you impose this regulation, there's a huge essentially waste of workers in compliance tasks that reduces wages, and so you're going to have to trade off the fact that allocative efficiency can increase welfare with the fact that you have this reduction in the terms of trade. Still, right, what we saw in the previous graph is that for at least low levels of G, your welfare can go up. So there is some positive amount of regulations that's optimal here. Now, what's going to be kind of the second part of the paper that we have is the fact that there's also this positive externality on foreign firms. So again, what's happening here is that because you're getting rid of a lot of low quality firms, endogenously, the average profits of the surviving firms are going up. That increases the number of firms that draw from the quality distribution, right? So that entry goes up. And so there's this externality where high quality firms, there's more high quality firms in foreign countries. And so their welfare is actually going up. And you can see this here. So just kind of quickly going through these figures, what you see is first, the effect of the regulation in the home country. The red line here is just the hump-shaped welfare that I showed you before. So for at least for low levels of G, you can raise welfare, not by much, but you can raise welfare until eventually welfare starts coming down in the home country because the terms of trade is deteriorating. However, in the foreign country, right, when Chile imposes the regulation, the welfare in Ecuador is going up. Right, and although there is loss in Ecuador in the sense that they have to pay these compliance costs to enter Chile, the gain in the sense that there's more high quality firms always dominates. This is, you can see kind of the difference between comparing that with the tariffs, because with tariffs, there's going to be a positive optimal tariff, right? And we know that from previous studies. There's going to be a pretty large optimal tariff here that can raise welfare at the home country quite significantly. However, any tariff in Chile is always going to lower the welfare in a foreign country like Ecuador. And so in this case, if you were to cooperate, you would always cooperate with no tariffs, right? Because if everybody imposes tariffs, everybody's worse off. This last figure is taking only the case for standards. What you can see is that if you have cooperation, if the two countries were to cooperate, the optimal standards are always going to be higher. And this changes for tariffs, right? So the more competition you have with tariffs, the less you need standards. But it's always going to be the case that the optimal standard is more than one. And if you have cooperation where both countries essentially promise to impose higher standards, they're losing and essentially not lose as much terms of trade, then the optimal standards will go up, right? And that gets essentially working with this positive externality. Okay, so then there's only a few minutes left. So we have this estimation. So what we're trying to do now is to look at the welfare implications of moving to optimal levels of standards, both non-cooperatively, so unilaterally, and cooperatively. And we're going to do this using standard hat algebra, where so after a lot of algebra, you can show that in this model, you can actually get to this type of ACR gravity formulation. So you need some data, and then you need to essentially do some estimation of some of these. So with the data on trade shares, you can then estimate wages. We take the employment sizes and tariffs from the data, then we estimate parameters. You can then estimate trade costs. And then with that, we show a way of getting these Gs, right? These Gs are the ones that you can't really get from the previous literature. So we show a way of estimating this using a simulated method at the moment. So I won't show you the way that the simulated method at the moment works, but essentially we use the exporter dynamics database to get information from I to J on the number of exporters, so extensive margin, and then also the distribution of exports. And then we can, from that, estimate what is the implied level of restrictiveness from I to J, okay? So we get these Gs, and then we calculate these welfare gains that I show you here, right? So there's different ways, different kind of counterfactuals that you can do. The first thing here is let's assume on the left side, we want to set optimal standards and compare essentially the welfare gain relative to having no standards at all. Okay, and you can do that in two ways. You can assume that each country imposes them one at a time. So say Colombia here imposes their optimal standards, but no one else does. That's the x-axis. And then you can also assume that all countries just impose the optimal regulations at once, just to kind of see what happens when countries are doing things all at once. And what you see is that, first of all, every country can gain by essentially raising standards above one. The value of the gains depending on the characteristics of the countries, which I won't have time to go over, right? But what you see is that when all countries impose their standards, the gains are always going to be higher than if one country did it one at a time. Again, because there's going to be this positive externality that's happening. And in this case, because everybody's increasing their standards, everybody's helping everybody else. In the second figure, basically what I show is that, what I'll show you from the paper is just that imposing these optimal standards has higher welfare gains than imposing no tariffs. And that just comes from the fact that because tariffs are so low, right, going to your optimal standards is actually going to be a higher benefit than everybody going to zero tariffs, which is going to help everybody. Okay, so even though tariffs do have kind of a higher magnitude here in terms of the way that they affect welfare, in the current policy regime, you could gain more by everybody going to the optimal standards and everybody just reducing tariffs to zero. Okay, and then there's this final thing that we do where we assume a two country setting, right? So in this two country setting, we can just assume that, say, Chile and Ecuador jointly set those standards in a way that they can cooperate. So we think two countries is a practical setting where two countries can actually cooperate with each other. And essentially what you see is, depending on the weight that countries get, right? So Chile gets no weight versus Chile getting a lot of weight. Depending on the weight, you can get to a point where both countries are better off than if they were setting standards unilaterally. And that just comes from the fact that now both countries, let's say if both countries get a weight of 0.5, they both get higher welfare relative to the unilateral case because they're both setting higher standards, because both of them essentially are not worried about the terms of trade deterioration that's going to happen if they did it by themselves. Okay, so the conclusion here is regulations can improve allocative efficiency when you have heterogeneous firms with this market power distortion. I'll say that this point one we make in a separate paper, that's the closed economy. Now we extend this to the open economy. What we think is more interesting in the open economy is the way that these regulations actually have a positive externality on trade partners that's not internalized by the imposing country, right? So there is this approach for policymakers where, lowering trade costs helps, and we show how lowering tariffs has welfare gains here, but that even with lower trade costs, you still have kind of this rationale for thinking about how misallocation fits into the cooperation on standards, right? When countries are thinking about what's the optimal amount of regulations to impose. Okay, and I'll stop here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Ariel. It's perfect timing. So we have time for one question. Is there any question for Ariel? So if not, then Ariel, I will ask you a simple question regarding the modeling strategy. You are modeling quality, and I mean, you didn't have time to get into the details. My question would be: there are a lot of papers in the literature that model also quality, like Juan Carlos Halak has a lot of papers on that. So what's the difference in the way you model quality here vis-a-vis these models, and what's the reason of that?
So in terms of the Halak paper, I guess it depends which. So I know they have at least one paper that's both like the process where they have like two different dimensions of quality. So here we have just one dimension. The reason why we go to quality here is because if you're thinking about these standards, it just intuitively makes more sense that the way they affect firms is not necessarily based on the distribution of productivity. It's based on the distribution of quality, right? Because what they're trying to do is get rid of the low quality firms. So like as an end result, you end up getting results that are very similar if you had firms that were heterogeneous in productivity. In fact, if these regulations, if what these regulations are doing is just getting rid of the small firms, and these small firms are both low quality and low productivity, right? Then you can really just get a similar result using a Mallett's model. I don't know if that makes sense.
No,
but really what's happening is that these regulations, by getting rid of low quality firms, which is what we think they're doing, they're really getting rid of the small firms, right? And these small firms also the ones that are intuitively less productive, right? And so you can increase allocative efficiency by getting rid of them, right? And reallocating your production to these higher quality firms. Again, going back to like Halak's papers, I can't think exactly of a specific one, but I mean, for the most part, I think they would have CES preferences. So you wouldn't have this market allocation aspect of it. You would have different aspects of reallocation, right? Because if the allocation would be efficient.
Thank you, Ariel. And one tiny question regarding the graph you show us with the countries, no? So I guess the specific country, because there were very few points, that one. So this is regarding data availability from the exporter dynamic database, no?
Exactly. Yeah.
And because I see a lot of Latin American countries here, like Ecuador, Chile, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, and so on.
I mean, essentially, we end up having to do this using a 16 by 16 matrix, so 16 countries, and then we have the rest of the world, what we say as the rest of the world.
Okay.
And that comes from the fact that we need, and the way we do this is first of all, we need to have, the EDD. We need to have both the origin, like we need to have trade flows from both the origin to the destination and from the destination to the origin. And like once you do that, you end up getting only 16 countries that you can put in here. And you can see they're very, essentially low income countries. And then you have Denmark. It's like really
exactly. I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So and that just comes. I mean, EDD is really helpful in this case because this type of data I think you really can't get anywhere else, but you're left with a pretty restricted sample size. Yeah.
No, sure. Thank you, Ariel. So now it's time to move on. Please, Monica, you can start your presentation after Ariel stops sharing the screen. Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you so much. Can you see the screen well?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Perfect. So thanks so much for the opportunity to present here, and it's great to be able to do it. So we're shifting gears somewhat to international investment agreements and double taxation treaties, and looking at how those are related to multinational activity. This is preliminary work, so all comments and suggestions are really welcome. So just jumping in terms of motivation, really what has motivated this work is this spread of economic integration agreements over time. And this is really quite notable when we look at the number of country pairs that are covered by these different agreements. Here you can see those over time, where international investment agreements are in red, double taxation treaties are in black, and the preferential trade agreements are in blue. And it has really been this rapid increase, but in particular between 1990 and 2010. And this is really where this study is focusing on. And also, if we would just like to look spatially, we really see this intensification of coverage of different countries with different types of agreements over time. So you have, again, IIAs at the top, double taxation treaties, and preferential trade agreements. And at the same time, what we have seen is there has been this parallel increase in multinational activity. So we'll explain the data source for this study in a second, but here, just using Orbis, you can see this rise in the number of multinational firms on the left side, and also the rise in the networks of the affiliates on the right side. So in a sense, the natural question that comes to mind is therefore, how are these two related? And in particular, when we think that international investment agreements actually aim to increase M&A activity, a question emerges, do they actually work? So do they achieve their first order objective? And so far, while we have quite a rich literature on the subject, it's first of all, mostly macroeconomic. There is literally one paper that uses microeconomic data. I'll show you a little bit more. And it's also very mixed. We see positive, negative results, no results at all. So really, it's very difficult to draw any conclusions from that. And meanwhile, there is a very strong policy interest in the subject. Should we continue signing those agreements, or should we rethink the strategy? So just the literature I will skip, but just to tell you that indeed there are a lot of macro studies. As I mentioned, there's only one microeconomic study by Peter Egger and Valeria Medlo, and they look at Germany only. So it's really just one home country. Here we would be looking at something broader. And also there is a very rich recent theoretical literature. So this public interest in the subject, and in particular in international arbitration embedded in these treaties, has really caused quite dynamic rise in the theoretical literature. And there are also some related studies focusing in particular on international arbitration. This again, I'll skip, but just to mention that there are these parallel literatures on other types of agreements. And again, microeconomic studies have been quite scarce. So I put them here in italics. And from the M&E location decisions literature, we really learned that the expansion of M&Es abroad happens mostly through the extensive margin. So this is something that we'll latch on in this study. So basically, what is it that we don't know looking at the literature? First of all, there is very limited microeconomic evidence on the effect of international investment agreements on M&E activity, on the channels through which these impacts happen, and also the possible heterogeneous effects, both across treaty characteristics, across country pairs, and also types of firms. So this is exactly what this paper is trying to do. It's trying to provide empirical macroeconomic evidence on the effects of investment agreements and M&A activity in a multi-country context. And we control for the presence of other economic integration agreements, but is not often done in this literature. And also we try to explore the mechanism through which treaties would affect M&A activity. And we focus specifically on the extensive margin, and moreover, a quite pure form of extensive margin, if you like. So really the first foreign entry of a multinational into the host economy. So when it's the first M&E affiliate established ever in that economy. And we also consider possible heterogeneous effects precisely to try to understand this mechanism further, both at the treaty design level, at the country pair characteristics, firm and sector characteristics, and the combinations thereof. So in case you need to disconnect, just to the preview of results, indeed we do find a positive and statistically significant effect of investment treaties only when coupled with double taxation treaties and the probability of M&E entry. So explain a little bit more the rationale and what it really tells us. And this estimated probability increases by slightly over 20%. And in terms of heterogeneous effect, those treaties only really are found to have an effect when they have this so-called ISDS clause. So ISDS is basically this clause that allows firms to sue states in case of incompliance through international arbitration. I will talk a little bit more about that, but that is really the teeth in the agreement that allows firms to enforce the provisions. So we find that it's only those IAAs with this provision that really matter. And it tends to have stronger effect in case of countries with lower quality of institutions, as theory actually predicts, and for larger and older firms, as well as only in differentiated sectors. We also find some evidence of indirect effect. So if I have time, I'll mention briefly something on that. So basically the effect of treaties with third countries on the probability of M&E entry. So briefly on these IIAs, what are they? How one should think about them? They come in different shapes and forms. They can be multilateral in nature. They can be bilateral. They also can be just basically provisions in a wider preferential trade agreement, or they can be standalone investment agreements. But the basic idea is always the same. The goal is to try to promote FDI for greater protection given to the investor. That always has to be a foreign investor that is eligible under the treaty. And the economic idea is really that they reduce the so-called hold-up problem. So think about a firm that invests, and once the investment is sunk, the government actually decides to seize the assets of the company, and the firm is not able to generate profits. So this is exactly what these treaties try to deal with, resolve, in a sense that the state now has a commitment mechanism in the form of an investment treaty not to seize those assets. And if it tried to, the firm actually can sue it in international arbitration. So building on other studies, the way to think about it is the reduction of fixed cost of entering into a given host market. So actually similar sort of mechanism that we saw in our Yale's paper. In terms of the components of IIAs, I won't go into detail. Really something to just bear in mind is that this investor state dispute settlement mechanism that I mentioned, or ISDS, is really sort of the core provision that allows investors to enforce what is in the treaty. And this is what we will focus on in this paper. So going into the empirics, let me just tell you very briefly on the data that we have. We basically try to combine two different sources of information. On the one side, we have a large database of economic integration agreements from 1960 till 2016. We have information on the coverage of different country pairs at the time of ratification of those agreements from UNCTAD and OECD. We also gather information on preferential trade agreements from different sources, and we do the same for double taxation treaties. Just to mention that rarely studies actually control for these different treaties. Sometimes they are really more of an afterthought. You might have a control for a PTA, but not necessarily for DTT. And in terms of the data for M&Es, the data is from Orbis. Probably many of you are familiar with it. It has been used widely in the literature. We do a large cleaning exercise whereby basically we have to just make sure that the data is comparable. So for example, we get rid of companies that are actually branches. We really want to make sure that these are separate affiliates. We want to know in which sector and host country these affiliates are, et cetera, et cetera. We basically have at the end a sample of 45,000 of M&Es with around 130,000 affiliates globally, operating in 131 host countries over this period of 1990 to 2010. And in terms of the empirical approach, let me just control how much time I have.
You have 10 more minutes, don't worry.
10 more minutes, perfect. Okay, so I can slow down a little bit. Good. Perfect. So in terms of the specification, so I've mentioned already that this is a firm level approach, right? So here what we're trying to understand is the probability of an entry of an M&E from an M&E F here from a sector S and a home country I in a host country J in time T. So this is really what we're looking at. And what is of most interest to us is looking at this coefficient on the presence of an IIA between a country pair IJ in time T, actually T-1, so this is lagged by 1 period. And we also control for the presence of these other economic integration agreements. So this would be the second term here. Think about preferential trade agreement or a double taxation treaty, but we also want to know what is the effective combination of those agreements. So the third term is the combination of an IIA with another agreement, such as PTA, for example. And finally, it's also the combination of these other agreements. So think about a combination of an preferential trade agreement with double taxation treaty that would be captured by the fourth term. And then we have a bunch of controls. And this is really the sort of advantage also of doing it at the country level, that we can really control for quite a few sources of heterogeneity. So first, we include the firm host country fixed effect. So this subsumes in this setting already the home host country fixed effect. So think about the standard gravity invariant controls such as distance or common language, etc. This would be subsumed, but also it would account for more granular sources of heterogeneity. For example, if the firm was investing in a particular destination based on specific comparative advantages of different countries, this would be accounted for. So think about a mining company going to mining intensive locations. This is what we're capturing with this fixed effect. Then we also have the firm year fixed effect. So again, it subsumes also a home year fixed effect. So anything that would be time variant at the level of home country and could impact also investment decisions of firms is already captured. So again, think about outward FDI strategies or some sort of support schemes by the government, by the home government, that would be captured, but also everything that varies at the level of the firm over time. So this could be, for example, the width of the affiliate network globally, or the internationalization strategy more generally, or just the quality of management practices that vary over time. And finally, we have this host sector year fixed effect. So this would basically account for anything that varies over time at the level of host country. So for example, if there were other inward investment attraction schemes, think about activities of investment promotion agencies or any incentives that are given by the government, we would capture it with the fixed effect. So in that setting, we control for the traditional we account for the multilateral resistance precisely by this combination of fixed effects, and we also go slightly more granular controlling for firm level characteristics. And just to mention that we have also two other types of controls. One is time variant M&E host country specific controls, here captured by this M&E-F, JT-1. And this basically is, for example, the number of affiliates that the M&E has globally outside of the host economy. So that deals with just the size, if you like, and internationalization of that M&E. And we also include bilateral controls at the host home country per level, such as in joint bilateral trade or the FDI stock. So for example, if there was some nationality specific agglomeration effects that the presence of M&Es from that home country of M&E actually induces that M&E to enter, which we know from the literature tends to have positive effects, we would also control for that. So bearing that in mind, let me just mention this is exactly the same equation that you have just seen. These are the same variables. The only thing that changes is that we now are able to differentiate the effect by group Z. So here Z really identifies types of groups that we would be interested in to explore these heterogeneous effects. So think about different types of agreements, different types of country pairs, sectors, or firm to really see if these treaties have a different effect on M&E's entry. Okay, so I see that I have 5 minutes left. And with that, I can share some of the results with you. So as I mentioned, what we really try to do is identify which specific combination of agreements has an effect. And what we find here is that having just an IIA on its own does not seem to increase the probability of M&E entry. It's really the combination of a double taxation treaty, which on its own is statistically significant, with an international investment agreement. And, you know, we can talk more about the rationale here, but it's really that having an IIA is just not enough. It's also when through an ISDS, and I will talk about it later, you can also ensure that your tax treatment stays stable and predictable over time. And perhaps actually I'll go through that very quickly because I won't have time on that. I will want to jump a little bit more into the heterogeneous effects to show you some of the mechanism, but just let me tell you that we've done a lot of different robustness checks. You know, we control for any pre-trends. We don't really find anything there. We also do a placebo that confirms that, you know, makes us a little bit more confident in the results. We control for the host home time trend between countries. We also just focus on the country pairs without any economic integration agreements to make sure that it's a little bit of a more homogeneous group of countries that we're looking at. And we also remove some of the largest firms in case you would be concerned that it's still the largest firms that could be impacting the signature of the treaty. So just to mention that already the indigeneity concerns are reduced in our setting because it's less probable that any individual firm would be able to influence the ratification of the treaty. But if we are concerned that indeed there are such important players that could do that, we remove them from the sample, we do different tests there, and the results stay the same. So I'll skip all of that. Please feel free to ask me in the end if you have any particular question regarding this. Just to mention that also in terms of composition, we do a number of checks, in particular removing the tax havens to make sure that this is not tax planning that actually is driving our results. This stays robust, and the same when we do just different tests on the composition of countries in the sample. Okay, so just a few words on the heterogeneous effects. First of all, I mentioned this famous ISDS. So what we find here is that really it is the combination of those IIAs with DTTs with ISDS that have a statistically significant effect. So we don't find any effect of those treaties without ISDS. And when we look a little bit deeper in terms of what that means, you know, you could say it's really just the signaling of signing the treaty. It's not necessarily this enforcement mechanism that you're talking about. It's really just the fact that the government is signing this treaty, that is sending the signal to investors that they mean their business and therefore M&Es enter. Well, when we split the types of treaties, depending on whether they actually have been enforced or for the period when they were just signed but not ratified, or they have never been ratified, it's really just the treaties that have indeed been ratified and have the binding effect that matter. And moreover, it's those treaties that, for the country pairs that have never experienced an ISDS case. So as I mentioned, the firm can actually sue the state in case of incompliance. So a presence of such a case could send indeed a signal that the government is actually not honoring its commitments. And this is consistent with what we're finding. We're only seeing the positive effect of those treaties until there has been such a case experienced by the host state. And in the last minute that I think I may have like 1.5 minutes or something. So let me just say that the effects really are mostly focused on larger, older, and more experienced firms, that these effects are mostly in differentiated sectors where we would imagine that problems in contract enforcement would be higher, and also in countries with lower quality of institution, when indeed international arbitration could feasibly play this role of reducing the holdup problem. So I won't go into the spillover effects since I'm out of time, but let me just say that, you know, we do find some evidence of the IIA's effect in increasing probability of M&E first foreign entry. We do also find some important heterogeneous effects, In particular, it's the combination of those IIAs with double taxation treaties that seems to matter. And it's the treaties that have this ISDS mechanism embedded in them. And in particular, until the country pair has actually experienced an ISDS case, and in the host countries with weaker domestic institutions and firms that are larger and older. So I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to address those.
Thank you very much, Monica. Also perfect time in 20 minutes exact. So I asked the audience where there are some questions for Monica.
I don't know if we have so much time for questions, or we can do this also like more discussion afterwards, but
Sure.
I'm curious. I mean, I found super interesting the paper. I'm wondering whether you care, I don't know exactly in which direction it's going to go, but control, for example, for the fact that the multinationals already have entered or have affiliates in the same region as the country where is introducing the affiliate. It's very interesting, this result that you have, that having the tax treaty matters. It is the tax treaty already in place when the IIA is there, or is it, they come together? I'm just curious about this. And just a small point, I mean, it seems like your results are significant. I just want to know what you think about the magnitudes, you know, in terms of like the effects that you're finding. And that's it, Monica. Thank you so much for the presentation.
So following Vanessa, I have a same line of reasoning. It would be nice to look at the sequence of the agreements, no? So you can build kind of a more homogeneous group. Imagine that you have countries that have, because what seems to matter is the combination, IAS and DTT. Imagine countries that have IAS, DTTs. What happened for this when they combine them relative to those that keep one of those, for example? So the sequence following what Vanessa said, I think would be interesting. And the other thing is the ISDS seems to be something important here, making a difference. Probably for a separate paper, it would be interesting to know how many farms are involved in those cases. What are those farms? And yeah, this kind of things seems to matter. It's like raises a question definitely for a separate paper to understand more about them.
Fantastic. First of all, great questions. Thank you. Maybe let me attack the one that is common, the double taxation treaties and IIAs. So this is exactly what begs, you know, a natural question, right? Like what comes first and what has a stronger effect? I have played with that a little bit. So indeed here, the setup is that country pairs can be subject to multiple treatment effects in a sense, right? Because they can first sign an IIA and then add a DTT, or vice versa, or they can sign them both. I haven't shown here the results, but actually when they sign them both at the same time, and when we limit the country pairs really just to those that have those three combinations possible, it's the signature of both at the same time that has a stronger, statistically significantly larger effect. But yes, definitely I have to add that to the paper and kind of explain more, you know, the sequencing and how that works. So duly noted. On the magnitude of the effect, yes, so the unconditional probability of entry is around 4%. So that's why, you know, the probability actually increases by around 20% when we take those coefficients. So, you know, 20%, I would say it's quite sizable, but I guess you're thinking, what would be the investment increase, right? I mean, could we compare it to something in terms of dollars value or something like that, or number of something along those lines? Vanessa, is this what you were thinking?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. And probably I also didn't remember quite well, you know, the means that you have for the simple stats, just to have more an economic idea of, yeah.
I see, right. So it's around 20%, you know, the increase in probability, but you know, one could think of, you know, different ways of sort of illustrating really the economic importance. And the ISDS point, yes, Christian. So definitely, this is actually what we're working with Emily Blanchard on right now. So the idea is really to look who sues, you know, what kind of firms sue, why do they sue, and what kind of design of ISDS really matters. So hopefully we can get a little bit more in detail and sort of also strategic considerations of firms behind this. So thanks a lot. And finally, Vanessa, the same region, absolutely, we can introduce different cuts.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Monica. We're looking forward to learning from the new research. And now we move to Vanessa.
All right. So can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. All right. So this is a paper with Michael Fioretti, Kegi Kawa, and Monica Morlaco. And in here, we try to explore the two-sided market power in firm-to-firm trade. So let me go ahead. So what is the motivation of this paper? Basically, these days, we know that about 80% of the trade transactions are occurring within global value chains. So basically, this includes imports that are often very specific, and these intermediate inputs are used in production to satisfy domestic demand, but also to export to third markets to use in subsequent stages of the production process. So, and there are two features of firms that are involved in global value chains that have recently received important attention. The first of them is that firms are granular. So basically, they are not atomic, and meaning that they account for a sizable share of the market. But also, these firms often engage in bilateral negotiations to agree on prices, which is very different to the assumption that we often made in our simple models, in which firms interact in anonymous markets where prices are determined basically by market clearing conditions. So a second related feature of firms that are in global value chains is that both buyers and sellers are actually exerting a substantial amount of market power to determine these terms of trade. So basically, the question that we are going after in this paper, we are trying to understand is how two-sided market power can affect prices in a context where we have firm-to-firm transactions. And we think this is an important question, for example, to understand the intensive margin responses of global value chains to shocks, as some of the important shocks we have experienced in the recent years. So now, incorporating these features of granularity and bargaining power actually have also important challenges. The first challenge that comes to our mind is the fact that the trade data, the firm level trade data in particular, is quite rich, but most of the time it's just one-sided. So we are going to resolve this by having a data set which we can identify both sides of the transaction, importers and exporters, and where we also can bring richness in terms of what we do know for each of these partners. The second challenge is more methodological, like modeling layers of granularity and market power is actually a complex task. So, and we try to handle that with the model I'm going to present in a second. And basically, the idea is that having enhanced a theory of two-sided market power trade can have a number of important implications for questions as, for example, what are the firm determinants of import pass-through elasticities? So basically, we see in the US-China, let's call it war or tensions, if you prefer. And those tensions have, we see important papers showing us that actually pass-through seems quite complete, which with some simple model, you can be a little bit surprised about that, given that US is a large country. So you will expect some less complete pass-through in that situation. And so we think that we can speak about this in this model. And also, of course, for a following up paper, actually, we are thinking more about what are the implications of this theory when a group of firms or individual firms are being target of trade policy, as happened with anti-dumping data or countervailing duties, for example. So what we do in this paper, just to be more specific, is that we start by providing a general pricing framework of firm-to-firm trade, in which both sides of the transaction, buyers and sellers, are going to have market power when they negotiate price. So basically, this is going to be tractable, not only provide this, but also going to tractable nest more traditional pricing frameworks, such that where only the buyer or only the seller are the ones with market power. So the second thing that we're going to do is actually characterize the role of two-sided granularity and market power, and we're going to use this framework to actually try to understand what happens with bilateral markups in terms of their levels, as well as their changes in terms of the pass-through, how they move when we are hit by let's say, a cost shock. The second, we take this general framework to a novel two-sided trade data set. And basically, in short, because like not going to have time to go in this in detail, but this firm level data set is basically the US lifted data, which is a custom data, which you can actually identify the buyer as well as the seller. And you have information for the prices and the quantities. Basically, you can pin down unit values for each transaction in each year, in each HS10 product code. And we have information for the USI by the census of manufacturers and also the longitudinal business data set inside the census. So we know more information about what these firms do at home, but also we know what these foreign partners are doing abroad by merging all this data set at the other side of the transaction. So the second data that we put together for this paper is relative to trade shocks. So basically we have the universe of anti-dumping investigations from 2001 to 2008, and also tariff changes, in particular with the trade war in US and China that we used to investigate or empirical setting. And basically what we take is the predictions of the model, and we find that some empirical evidence that are consistent with those. And finally, we basically take this model to the data, and we estimate some of the main parameters of that model, and we evaluate what is the model performance that we have. And basically, there are empirical challenges that are important here. The most important one is like this match level bargaining power is unobserved in our case. And you're going to see we have a Nash setting in which this is an important parameter to have, and we're going to propose an identification strategy to be able to identify them. So if I don't have time to conclude, sorry, I think I was in the wrong slide. Apologies for that. Just if I don't have time to go over the entire slides, I just want you to have some important takeaways. The first one is that in terms of the theory, we are able to deliver a very concise and stylized formula for bilateral markups. And it is basically a weight average between the cases that you are going to have for markups in an oligopoly model only and in an oligopsony model only. So basically, you're going to have a weight average between these two extreme cases, where the weights are basically denoted by this phi, and this phi tilde ij is basically the importer's relative bargaining power. So, and the other thing that is important is that these bilateral markups in oligopoly and oligopsony cases are a function of observables in our case, which is basically the supplier market share and the buyer market share. And what we refer for this is the supplier market share is just the relative importance of a given supplier in the import basket of a US buyer, and the buyer market share is the relative importance of this buyer in the export basket of a foreign supplier. So what we do is like we're going to show analytically, but also we're going to test empirically some of the main predictions of the model. So in terms of the markups, we found that markups are going to increase in the supplier market share, but they're going to decrease in the buyer's market share, as well as in the buyer's bargaining power, or buyer's relatively bargaining power. And the pass-through, so these changes in markups follow up a shock, they are going to decrease in the buyer's market share and may or not increase or decrease in the supplier's market share. And one thing that we do once we take this once we estimate the main parameters of the model or two-sided trade data, is that we are going to show you how our model predicts more accurately than other traditional alternative pricing frameworks these price changes that come after we face a shock. So I'm going to skip the literature, and let's go a little bit just with a very nutshell of what is model overview. So what we do is like, we do not speak in this paper about extensive marking. So basically we take the firm-to-firm linkages as given. And this is basically on the observation that there are large barriers to supplier adjustments, and which basically delivers relationships that are often persistent. And there are other papers working on this side of the extensive marking of this problem. But we focus on the intensive marking. And in particular, we're going to focus on a given link of the global value chain. It's basically on a relationship between an exporter and a US importer. And they are going to change an intermediate input. They are going to negotiate bilateral over the terms of trade. They're going to choose what is the price and follow the demand curve to choose what the quantities are. And they're going to have an upside option, which in our baseline is going to be as simple as the profits that each of them are going to have once the links just terminate. So imagine that relationships terminate, and that's the profits they're going to have, and there is no renegotiations allowed in the model. So basically, this is a pricing partial equilibrium framework. And in order to tractable and feasible analyze that equilibrium, we are going to resort to a Nash in Nash equilibrium concept, where basically what we have is that we're going to have a Nash bargaining solution for the pair. That's going to be the price, that the bilateral price that they're going to agree on, given that all other pairs are already in an agreement in a Nash equilibrium. And in our baseline, we're going to think that producers are single product and that elasticities are homogeneous, but we relax these two assumptions in an appendix in the paper. And the parameters are in red and observables are in blue. So just to give you an idea, basically, we are going to focus here on a given relationship, taking as given this multilateral type of networks that our framework allows for. So basically, importer J, and this is the US border, importer J can be by a given intermediate input. Think about this, an HS10 product from multiple suppliers, foreign suppliers, and we're going to focus right now in this particular relationship. So what you're going to have is that this particular J importer is going to have a production function, which is going to put together in a Cobb-Douglas fashion labor, domestic intermediates, as well as a composite or a bundle of foreign intermediate inputs. Those foreign intermediate inputs are going to be combined in a CS fashion with a raw, that is just the elasticity substitution across these foreign varieties. And what is interesting here is that, also in a CS fashion, of course, the price of the price of this foreign bundle that importer J faces. And these elements in blue here that we can observe is kind of the main element that is the object of analysis, let's say, in this paper. The final demand is very easy. So there we basically assume monopolistic competition, which together with a CES demand, you see that we have basically an isoelastic, very simple demand. And that's going to deliver just constant markups, where the markups are a function of that final elasticity of demand. Importantly, in the upstream input, we're going to have that the cost that the producers face is increasing in output. So we're going to have decreasing returns to scale in this case. So theta is going to measure that return to scale is the return to scale parameter, and it's going to be lower than 1. You're going to see that in our estimation, it happens that we actually, we found that it's lower than 1. And that is very important in our case, because that's the only case in which the bargaining power of the buyer translates in market power of the buyer when they actually negotiate the price. All right. So I'm going to skip this just for terms of timing. That's the concentration I explained before. So this is the Nash problem that firms try to solve. So basically, they are going to find what is the price that basically are going to maximize this joint surplus, and they're going to do by taking as given the demand that they have downstream, the supply upstream, all those characteristics I show you in a second, and taking basically the network of the global value chain as given. And in this case, there are two parameters that are very important. One of them is the bargaining power, that in this case is of the buyer. So this is the importer's negotiated bargaining power, and this is exogenous. This is what we are also estimating in the paper. And the other, of course, important part are the outside options. As I said, there is no renegotiations, and it's as simple as taking, you can think about this as a short-run elasticity of profits, because it's just the profits that you get if that link gets terminated. As I told you before, our results are like price is just a markup over marginal cost, but the markup can be written as a weight average of these two extreme cases. And just let me show you a second that these weights are a function not only of the relative bargaining power of the buyer, but also of this endogenous buyer outside option, which is a complex object, which is a function of several of the parameters of the paper, but also of the concentration of buyer and seller as observables that we have. So what are the predictions that we have for markups in terms of the supplier share. So I'm going to put here at the top just the formula that I showed you before. And let's try to think what we will have if the entire bargaining power relies on the supplier only, which is basically Borgensen and Atkinson type of flavor. So that's what you're going to have here if the weights goes to 0. Well, if you do that, you're going to get the classic traditional result of oligopoly models, where this is the functional form for the elasticity, and they are going to be a weight average between that row, that is elasticity across foreign varieties, and the elasticity of the final demand. And that weight average is going to be governed by weights, which are just the concentration of the seller in the basket of the importer. And we show that actually this an increasing function, so basically bilateral markups are increasing in supplier share. The second is the buyers. What happened with the buyer has the full market power. So basically, before we have buyers that are price takers. Now we have buyers that are the ones that have the complete power in the negotiation. And we don't think often about that in the literature, but this is the way that the oligopsony markup will look like. And an interesting thing that I want to tell you is, like, if theta is equals to 1 and you have constant return to scale, so basically you don't have rents to get out of the supplier, then doesn't matter how big that buyer is, how relevant that buyer is in the basket of the supplier. Doesn't matter, the markups just don't change, and it's just basically equals 1. So it doesn't translate in market power for the buyer. Now, when you allow for decreasing return to scale, then the picture is different, and now you have a mark down, basically. The increasing the buyer share, when the buyer share increases, we're going to have a lower mark of mu ij. And so that's what I want to go there. Now, a natural application for us, it is to try to understand what happened when we face a shock, how prices will change. So basically, all this theory of two-side market power and firm-to-firm trade, how that relates, or what implications that have when a firm just face a cost shock, and how prices will change. So we can always just basically denote the log change in prices, bilateral prices, as a function of the bilateral markups and the cost of the seller, and this shock that you can think about this cost push shock as an anti-dumping duty or import tariff that firms are facing. And in here, we're going to have 3 channels that I want to bring to your attention. The first one is the input substitution channel. That is exactly what is involved already in models of when you have oligopoly only. And the idea is as follows. When you're hit by a cost shock, let's say your cost is going to increase because a tariff has been imposed, then as a seller, you're going to try to adjust your markup just to avoid these buyers to just substitute to alternative suppliers. So in doing that, you're going to reduce the markup, and this is the main the main reason of pass-through incompleteness in the literature. And just to show you a picture of how that's going to look like, we basically are going to have like this part only. I'm going to show you this in a second, but this will be how the pass-through IJ will look like if we believe in bargaining power going completely to the seller, just to fix ideas. And you're going to see that it's a U shape, and the supplier share increases, the pass-through declines. But this strategic complementarity is less important when the supplier is or very small or very large. Now, if we go now to the endogenous, there is a second term that is the endogenous buyer power, and this is unique to this paper. Let's say that's part of the contribution of this paper. And the idea here is that when you are facing a cost shock, you probably are going to also have this standard case of demanding less. And if you demand less as a buyer, your share in the export basket of that foreign supplier is going to get reduced. And when it gets reduced, also you lose bargaining power, right? You lose power in the negotiation of the bilateral prices. So basically, this is what is going to counteract the most regular incomplete pass-through type of channel. That is what we have here. So it's interesting because exactly this buyer power, this is going to go, let's say, in opposite to the buyer, because it's exactly what is going to make that that pass-through to be more than complete. That's what is going to do this channel. And in here, what I'm showing you is how that pass-through relates to the buyer share. So the larger the buyer share, that pass-through is going to be lower and lower and lower. Finally, one thing I want to show you here is like everything that is in solid lines. We are thinking there about a situation in which basically only the buyer or only the seller have market power, but when P is equal 1, it is a case where they have, let's say, half and half of bargaining power. And the lines there are just showing you how that changed. So basically, yes, the structure of the competition matters, concentration of bargaining power. So or markups are basically going to decrease with importer share, may increase or decrease with exporter share, but increases with the importer's bargaining power. That is what we are showing here with the dots lines. And there is a cost channel that basically we control for when we go to the empirics, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So basically, I show you what the data is. I already said the most important things, so I will skip this just in terms of time, which I'm not sure how long I have, but I guess a few minutes.
I would say 2 minutes, Vanessa.
2 minutes. Okay, so we are almost there. So these bilateral share and prices, the first thing I want to show you is like prices have a positive relationship with supplier share and a negative relation with the buyer's share, as our model predicts. And we do a lot of robustness, fixed effects to show you that this is the case. The second thing that we do is try to understand how, just to follow the theory and said, well, how these concentration variables are going to have a role in the pass-through that we're going to have on prices when we have an anti-dumping tariff change, let's say. And what we found, as the theory predicts, as I showed you in those figures a second ago, is that the larger the concentration of the buyer, then you're going to have a negative result in pass-through, so prices are going to decline. But the opposite happens with seller. Actually, in the theory, is ambiguous, and what we found is an insignificant positive effect. Just to quickly show you what we do, so we have to estimate these two parameters, and we resort in a strategy to do that just for time issues. The only thing that I probably want you to take is like, we are going to assume that Pij tilde is going to be a monotonic relationship with a set of covariates, which those are covariates that are very correlated with bargaining power. And we get very sensitive estimates. So basically, we're going to have that phi being a function of covariates with a parameter kappa. But the other parameter that we need to know is the constant return to the return to scale. So basically, we found very precise estimates for our kappa vector for these variables that are basically helping us to construct a log linear relationship with those phis, and that's the way that we can get these bilateral Pijs. And the scale parameter theta, which is 0.43, clearly below 1. And if you, because this is have to disclosures, unfortunately, I just can give you 2 moments of the Pij. And the Pij is 0.76. Remember that this is relative bargaining power of the buyer. So 1 will be where both of them have bargaining power, but you see that it's not too far away from that. So certainly both of them have bargaining power. It is important to consider these type of things. And just finally, let me show you that how our model behaves. So basically, if we do run the changes in prices, in observed prices versus to what the models predict, and you compare our model, which is the one in green, the baseline, relative to Atkinson and Bernstein, in which there is no bargaining power for the buyer whatsoever. They are just price takers, and there are constant return to scale. You see that we can explain a larger fraction of the variance in comparison, depending of the fixed effects. And also with Gopinath and Kotsky, which they are going to allow for this bargaining power to be for the seller and the buyer, but because they have constant return to scale, they don't have this buyer channel, the market power for the buyer as we do have. And so we also perform better relative to that. And so basically the takeaway is that bilateral markups and pass-through elasticities are going to depend of bilateral concentration and relative bargaining power. So these are the stellar parts of what we do. And few sufficient statistics could help to predict price responses to cost shocks. And with two-sided market power, aggregate pass-through is going to depend of the sources of markups heterogeneity across firms. So basically, the message is that only the aggregates will not give you. It is important for us to understand what are the micro foundations that allow us to see what we see in the aggregates. Thank you so much. So I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. We don't have time for questions, but let's have one question in case there is one from the audience. I will not ask you anything because we can continue bilaterally.
Sure.
So what is there is any question from the audience, is the right moment to raise it. Otherwise, we move to the last presentation.
So just, I guess, very quickly, just looking.
Sure, go ahead, Ariel, please.
Very quickly, what you had there. So relative to something like Atkinson and Burstein, you guys get higher pass-through, like to say it very simply. Is that true?
Exactly. We are going to have forces that counteract that incomplete pass-through, and which is going to be more in line, for example, what we are observing right now with this empirical testing of the trade war situation.
Right. And you can compare that to, I guess, I always thought the pass-through was pretty low in the data. I guess
that's true most of the time. That's true. It should be in a country like the US. It's interesting that in the last kind of like vector of papers dealing with these shocks that we really have experienced are finding like consistently full pass-through in different sectors, different situations, different data sets. So yeah, and we offer a portrait of pass-through changes which can capture, and not only capture, but help us to understand why that's the answer that we are observing in the aggregate. That would be the idea.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's interesting.
Any other question? Well, then let's move to this last presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, then let's move to this. This is also a work in progress. It has been a work in progress for a long time, I would say, and it's a matter for us to find the time to make the big push for this paper. And if you saw the previous presentation, this is a presentation that in terms of data will go even downwards in terms of the level of disaggregation of the data, because we'll be like adding to what Vanessa just explained us in terms of having data on export trade between firms across borders within country, what happens within country. So the question we try to address in this paper is what's the effects of linking up with multinational firms on domestic firms' exports. And this is a joint work with several colleagues, with Jerónimo from the University of Colorado, Ignacio, who is now in Brussels, and with Gianmarco Ottaviano. So I will not spend too much time with this audience trying to convince you that multinational firms are really important actors in the global economy. Just a few statistics: they produce around 30% of the global output. They generate approximately 50% of world exports and imports. They are responsible for about 1/4 of the global employment. And in some countries, they are even larger. For example, multinational firms account for more than 80% of exports in France and roughly for 90% of exports in the United States. But this is not a paper about OECD countries. So this is a paper about one Latin American country, which is Uruguay. So let me introduce then the multinational firms, so the foreign affiliates of multinational firms in Uruguay. These multinational firms make up less than 1% of the total number of firms that register sales and purchases in the country, but they are responsible for more than 15% of their respective total values. They account for 10% of the total employment, and they generate more than 60% of the total exports. So, and I will stress that they are responsible for more than 15% of the domestic purchases, because that's something that we will look at here. So when you see the specific firms, you will see that they are larger than domestic counterparts in terms of domestic sales, the number of domestic firms they sell to, the number of employees, the labor productivity, exports. But what matters for this paper is that they buy a lot of more from other firms, and they have a relative large number of domestic firms they buy from. And you can see that very easily in graphical terms through these kernel densities. What you have here is the kernel density distribution of domestic purchases by type of firm. And what you see is that multinational foreign affiliates of multinational firms operating in Uruguay have larger purchases in the country. And this is specifically even more the case when the multinational firms are themselves exporters. And the same happens when you, instead of looking at the volume of the sales, you just consider the number of suppliers to those firms. There's a significant number of suppliers, which is pronouncedly larger for multinational firms or foreign affiliates of multinational firms that operate in the country, especially when they are exporters. And of course, you can do a very simple premium analysis. It has been done in the literature. So you regress the log of all these variables in a binary indicator that tells you it's a foreign affiliate of a multinational firm or not, and then you account, say, for sector fixed effect. And what you see here is that these foreign affiliates of multinational firms, they are larger in terms of domestic purchases, and they are significantly larger also in terms of the number of suppliers. Now, what this data tells us is that multinational firms have broad networks of input-output relationships, and that they are linked to a significantly large number of domestic firms. Given all these connections, the question arises naturally of whether and how linking up with multinational firms affect domestic firm performance. And for sure, and I know that you know this literature, there has been several papers trying to look at different ways in which being in connection with a multinational firm affects the performance of domestic firms. There are these vertical spillovers, there are horizontal spillovers, there are labor turnover. I will not go into the detail because I'm sure you know the literature. But in this paper, we look at a very specific outcome, which is exports. And there is a literature here, even increasing in recent years, where you can see that FDI enhances export activities in the host countries in terms of several dimensions, like increasing the export orientation of domestic firms, establishing the new trade links, or upgrading even the quality of countries and firms' export baskets. Now, the problem when you look into this literature is that you assume the linkages. You never see the linkages. You assume that the linkages that are present just based on input-output tables. So there is a multinational firm in one sector, there is a domestic firms in another sector. If the input-output table tells you that the sector of the domestic firm sells to the multinational firm, then you assume that there is a connection. Or you assume there is some kind of connection based on the co-location, where they share the same location within the country. Now, there might be substantial differences between these aggregate measures and what actually happens at the micro level. There is a very interesting paper by some colleagues in Costa Rica where they show that there is indeed this difference, and they exploit this data of the connection between firms in the country to establish that Costa Rican domestic firms experience strong improvements in performance, including TFP, when they start selling to a multinational firm. Here, we'll not look at what happens to these domestic outcomes, but we just look at what happens to domestic firms when they link up with multinational foreign affiliates of multinational firms in terms of their export behavior. So to be more precise, the question we try to address are three. How does linking up with multinational firms affect Uruguayan domestic firms' export outcomes? To what extent are these effects heterogeneous? And what are the mechanisms behind these observations? And this is a typical slide I would like to call the politician slide, because we will not have any clear answer for this question. The first one, because we have to work on the identification. The second, because we just look at a few dimensions of heterogeneity. And the third is that because we still need to work on the mechanism. So sorry for over-promising here. So it's a work in progress. That's the reason. So, and I will not follow Monica here. I will not tell you what we find. So because I want you to stay with me until the end of the session, given that the last one. So I want to keep you in the room. So let me tell you how we measure things here, and that's one of the contributions of the paper. We spent literally 2 years to build this database. Yeah. So we have three main databases. We have databases on domestic firms' attributes and outcome measures. And this is a combination of two databases. The first one is one from the tax agency at the firm level that provides us with data on location, sector of activity, starting year, employment, and sales for the population of formal firms in the Uruguayan economy between 2008 and 2016. Then we have customs database at the transaction level, and this is very similar to what Vanessa was explaining us. This is data on product-specific export and import by firm pair. So we know exactly which firm is selling to which firm, buying from which firm, what's product, and this is at the transaction level covering the period 2000-2017. And then we combine that with data from the location of affiliates of multinational firms coming from the workbase, and we are familiar with this database. But you know that the coverage of this database on similar ones is not so great when it comes to developing countries like Uruguay. So therefore, we combine that with a census of foreign affiliate of multinational firms that was carried out by the investment promotion agency in the country Uruguay 21. And then finally, and that's the key piece of information, we have data from also the tax agency, which is BIT data, BIT declarations that allow us to accurately map connections between all firms in the economy, in particular between multinational firms and domestic firms over a 4 years of period, but we are planning to expand it now until 2020. So let me give you a snapshot of the data. So about 1/3, if you look at this figure, 1/3 of the domestic firms in the economy, 1/3 of the 50,000 firms in Uruguay that are formal and registering sales and purchases are connected to a multinational firm. Most of them are just connected to one foreign affiliate of a multinational firm. And then if you go downwards, so there are some connected with many. In general, domestic firms are just connected with 1 or 2 or 5 foreign affiliates of multinational firms. Now, in terms of, let us do some naive exercise. So how does the likelihood for a firm to export looks like, depending on whether they sell to a multinational firm or not. And we restrict the sample here to firms that were not exporting before 2016. And they never sold to multinational firms before 2016. So they are like in the same year. What happened? So those domestic firms that sell to a multinational firm are much more likely to export directly than their counterparts that don't. And this is specifically the case when the foreign affiliate of the multinational firm is an exporter, and when it sells to more than one foreign affiliate of a multinational firm. And this is a dimension that we are exploring, and it will be very relevant for the mechanism, is that the likelihood to start exporting is significantly higher to the destination where the multinational firm has the headquarters or has some foreign affiliates. Now, let's go quickly through one slide on the empirical approach that we have so far. So essentially what we do is a diff analysis here. No? So we have an outcome variable, which is the export outcome. Does the firm export or not? Then we have the main explanatory variable, which is linkage. It's a binary indicator that takes the value of 1 if the domestic firm in a sector sells to a multinational firm. And then we have a set of controls that are like, depending on the value, could be the employment, could be total sales, could be even since we are talking about export outcomes, whether the firm receive assistance from the trade promotion organization of the country. You don't want to attribute to the linkage something that is related to some assistance support from an organization. So we can estimate this equation on a sample of firms that did not export and were not linked to a multinational firm in the past. So we are kind of newcomers in terms of exports, newcomers in terms of the linkages. So that restricts the sample significantly, but provide us with a clean and more homogeneous sample. And then we can allow for some heterogeneous effects. So let's go to the estimation results, because I have 1 minute at least for the formal time. So the results, that's a baseline estimation. Essentially, what you can see here is that starting to sell to a foreign affiliate to multinational firm is associated with a significant increase in the probability that the domestic firm starts exporting directly. You can see here that we also allow for the possibility to the effect to be linked to the fact that the domestic firm might buy from the multinational firm. That does not seems to be something significant there. And just to make sure, in the most demanding specification, we control for frame fixed effect, sector year fixed effect, and we have a lot of control variables that are lagged. Total sales, total number of employees, where the firm imports or not, and whether it receives export promotion assistance. So we do the similar exercise lagging the linkage one period, because that one was contemporaneous and we find similar results. And we conducted a placebo test. So we forward the linkage, basically, and essentially we are estimating the effect in a period where there are no linkages, in fact, but we are assuming that future linkages are actually in the past. And what you see here is that there are, as you would expect, that there are no significant effects. Now, the question is, this is a matrix of linkages. You can assume that there may any linkages could matter. Is it that you sell to a foreign affiliate to a multinational firm that matters, or it also matters that you sell to a domestic firm that sells to a foreign affiliate of a multinational firm? And when you put all the controls, these are the third and fourth column, you don't see any significant impact. Seems to be only the direct effects. Still, what seems to matter here is that there seems to be a sequence. So if you are a domestic firm, Uruguayan firm that didn't export, didn't sell to a multinational firm, and you start selling to a domestic exporter, then you are more likely to start selling to a multinational firm. So if you didn't have any connection with firms and then you start selling to a domestic exporter, then you are more likely to start selling to a foreign affiliate to a multinational firm. And when you do that, then you are more likely to start exporting directly. So there seems to be a sequence that could provide interesting insights for the design of linkages programs in the country. Quickly on the heterogeneous effects. So the effect is significantly larger when the foreign affiliates of the multinational firms are exporting firms themselves, when the domestic firms are linked to more than one foreign affiliate of a multinational firm. And this is the part we are working on, and it's taking us a lot of time, because you see the number of observations, this is 55 million, because essentially what we can do is, okay, we have all the firms, whether all the possible destinations, and then we see whether or not, when you start exporting, where to matters. And it seems to be the case, because selling to a multinational firm that have headquarters or an affiliate in the destination country is precisely where you are more likely to start exporting. And seems to be a difference. It also matters where the domestic firm you are linked to in Uruguay has or not an affiliate in the destination, and seems to matter. But seems to matter differently depending where is the country of the headquarters of the foreign affiliate. If you are selling to the country of the headquarters of the foreign affiliate of the multinational firm, then you are more likely to sell to the multinational firm you are linked to. But if you are selling to a country where the multinational firm has a foreign affiliate, then you are more likely to sell to other firms there. And that's provided some hints or start thinking about the mechanism. And I stop here on the mechanism because this is exactly what we are working on right now, and we need to explore much more in detail. And just to conclude, so what we have so far is that domestic firms that start to sell to a multinational firm are more likely to start exporting. This is particularly the case when the multinational firm is an exporter itself and when there are more linkages. Non-exporting domestic firms that are already linked to a multinational firm and increase their number of linkages are more likely to become an exporter. So this I didn't show you, but it's also in the analysis. And in terms of the destination extensive margin, domestically linked firms tend to start exporting to countries where the multinational firm is headquartered, to the firm itself, or has affiliate to other firms. Now, there is a big elephant in the room here, which is endogeneity. No, you will tell me, oh, okay, this is endogenous. Yes, it's endogenous. So we are working on many things here, many possible avenues to address this. We are planning to do some instrumental variables approach. in combining information with investment promotion and trade facilitation. So we have very detailed information at the firm level and the transaction level on trade facilitation policies and investment promotion support. We will exploit input-output matrices that are separate from this database, and we exploit, as some papers have done, this sibling approach. And then we need to go much more in detail in terms of the potential heterogeneous effects of the linkages, and we need to explore the true mechanism of this effect, because they will inform how this effect that we observe come into life. So what are the reasons? Is it a matter of just learning about the product and then you can sell to other markets? Is because you get connections, or just information? There is additional information on you on some markets based on the fact that you are selling to a foreign affiliate of the multinational firm. So, and finish here like a movie. This is to be continued. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think we are over time, but we can continue the conversation.
Christian, I don't know if you mind a small question, and we can
Sure.
always chat later. But first of all, the data is insane. It's amazing. That's the dream data set I think we would like to have. And very interesting, like already the mechanisms that you're thinking of. And when you think about the headquarter versus whether I'm selling to the headquarter versus where I have an affiliate, I'm wondering about, when I'm thinking about serving, first of all, I'm wondering if we can see whether my client there is the actual headquarter or the actual affiliate. Because if, I don't know, if I'm selling to a German company and I already learned some sort of German procedures, then maybe I'm not only serving that headquarter country back in Germany, but also other firms. I'm thinking if I'm serving a German affiliate, it seems more likely to me that that German affiliate of the guy I'm serving at home is going to be more likely my client in that foreign market, and probably more, more difficult to serve other. I'm sure they are going to learn more about the country. Let's say, I don't know, Poland. This is a German affiliate in Poland. So I don't know if you have thinking about like, or from where you are thinking the difference are coming from.
So it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we are trying to explore is the product dimension, which so far is completely absent of the analysis. No? So what we have so far is that when you start exporting, then you are more likely to start exporting to where the multinational firm you are linked to in the country is headquarter or has an affiliate. But when you sell to, say, so you mentioned German. Say, imagine that you start exporting to Mercedes-Benz. And then you know that the headquarters of Mercedes-Benz is in Germany. Then when you sell to, if you start exporting to Germany, then you will sell to Mercedes-Benz, because we can see that in the data. So essentially what we are doing is that we are combining all the transaction level information that inform us the buyer with the word-based database that tell us where the headquarters of the multinational firms are. Now, the question is, why are you selling to that particular firm, and whether you are selling exactly the same product? We can observe the products at the country within Uruguay, but we can see the sector. And then we can see whether the product that is sold to the headquarters of the multinational firm belongs to the same sector. And we can do exactly the same in the other destinations, because in the other destinations, there might be the case, since you are not selling to, so you mentioned Poland. Imagine that you have the Mercedes-Benz has an affiliate in Poland. Then in Poland, then you will not sell to the affiliates. You are not more likely to sell to the foreign affiliate of Mercedes, but to other firms. Because again, combining all the data, you can see that you are not selling to that affiliate. And then there, it's a matter of really learning what's going on with the product. So if you learn that you can sell that product to the headquarters in Germany, you can sell it to other countries. And then there is also the geographic dimension of that. So the data is so rich that we have a huge, long list of things to explore. Because on top of what I'm saying is that imagine that you sell particular car components to Mercedes-Benz in Germany. Then you can see whether you are selling the same car component to another firm in other country. And then you can see not only that, you can consider the distance to in this other country relative to the headquarters. And the example you mentioned is a great one because you are very close to Germany. Then you are more likely, I guess, if we believe in all the papers we have been seeing over these years, that you will be more likely to sell to another firm that is closer in distance to the headquarters of the multinational. And there might be dynamics even there. So you might start exporting to the headquarters of the multinational firm you are selling, and then afterwards you sell to other firm in a neighboring country. All these dimensions that we plan to analyze. The dynamic, unfortunately, is something so far limited. We have 4 years of data. So when we have more data, trade data, more recent trade data, we can explore working with lags. But you have so many cuts in the data that will be very informative in terms of pin down the actual mechanism. And this for us is really stimulating. But just as I said, no, to be continued because we have to work harder on that.
Just
Great,
wanted to also say we can exchange further, Christian, but just to say really, really great work and super impressive what you collected. And, especially this information channel and how it really interacts, and especially sort of, in a sense, when the forces go against each other, so even thinking about Ariel's paper, does it matter if you actually link up with Mercedes-Benz and you have different standards then to deal with in a market that is, for example, not in the EU, and precisely that M&E channel somehow reduces the cost, But
no, that's interesting because when we think about distance is not only a physical concept, could be distance in terms of regulation. So you have different kinds of barriers, and that could be definitely. And thank you. And another thing that we are planning to do is like as in all our cases. I mean that applies to all of us. When we try to understand this kind of mechanism, one of the ways to proceed is just to try to approach some firms and try to understand what actually happened. No, because we find all these nice correlations and say, well, was it like that, or I'm kind of inventing story based on these correlations in the data. So we plan to talk to some firms since we see the names of the firm, we can approach and try to understand how it works, at least to have some insight from the actual players in the game. That's something that we are planning to do also in collaboration with the trade promotion organization in the country.
It seems like what's driving it is more so the connection between firms than like knowing about the processes of the country, right? Because if it was more about learning about like the German procedures, you would expect as soon as you start connecting with Mercedes that you'd also sell to BMW. And you don't. You think you're not seeing that?
That's actually a good point. Seems to be, could be that. It could be some. You have a point there. Could be something firm specific within the destination for the specific headquarters. But could be just the fact that it's like you are selling to that firm in the domestic market. And then they report, okay, these guys are good, and then you sell to the headquarters. Now there seems to be something else, because when you move to other countries, you are not selling to the foreign affiliates of this firm. You are selling more likely to start selling to others. Again, what we don't know so far, and we need to explore, is we are talking about the same product. Is the same product, or you are selling other products? And that will make a huge difference. Because you are selling other products, is that you are learning also in that dimension. Could be a related product. So there are so many things, but you are right that it's interesting the fact that, and again, the example is a very good one, that you are selling, say, to Mercedes, but you are not more likely to start selling to BMW. So this is something that we need to explore, especially, we could even discriminate that. again by sector, saying, because what we are doing there, in fact, you have a point, Ariel, what we are doing there is we are pulling all other farms, no? So we have, imagine that we are talking about Mercedes-Benz, no? In Germany. And then what we have is, do you sell to Mercedes-Benz vis-a-vis other firms? But these other firms are all of them, no? So we might discriminate, saying, when we introduce a sector dimension, could be, do you sell to Mercedes-Benz? Do you sell to BMW, Audi, or something else? And the others? Could be when you introduce that, there might be in this other, when you split, there might be a difference. Because we are pulling together and the effect is significant relative to this pool of others. But when you split this control group, we might find something. So we'll do that. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I guess some of it could just be also like timing, like you said.
Yeah, timing for sure.
2 years, maybe it takes time. So you first start with Mercedes, and then you go to BMW. But yeah, you can't do that if you can't look more than.
Yeah, that's for sure. And we plan to do it also, because I mean it's very interesting and fascinating. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, everybody, for being in the session. Vanessa, Monica, it was a pleasure to be with you in this session. And we can continue bilaterally. I mean, it's like so as you wish. It would be great, because I mean I love all the papers. It's very interesting, all of them in the angle they are working on. I mean, even Ariel, what you did is very relevant also for an agenda at the bank. So we have a colleague of mine, Juan, is working on this stuff of standards and regulations. He will be very interested in learning about what you are doing. In fact, I will tell him about your paper.
Is it Juan
Blight.
Okay.
I will tell him about your paper.
Okay.
And then again, good afternoon to all of you. Take care. Hope to see you soon and in person, hopefully next time.
Thank you so